We are going to have some fun today. And I'm not just talking about perhaps, a few laughs because I was talking with my guest today, Martha Carlin, before starting recording. And I can tell you she is a spitfire, tons of energy, incredibly great knowledge, and a history and a story that is going to knock you off your seat. Today, we're talking about the connections between soil health and microbiome. These are connections that maybe you've heard of theoretically, but she has firsthand knowledge of how that soil health can destroy or build up your health and someone you love. When her husband got diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, the disjointed, dysfunctional medical system that she was dealing with did not have answers for her. So this smart woman did what anyone who is on a quest did. She relentlessly dove into the research and asked questions and discovered how not only she could help her husband, but now how she can help tens of millions of other people. So, Martha, I'm excited to talk to you today and about your story and learn from you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, John. I'm looking forward to it.
So, tell people a little bit about your backstory.
So, my training actually in college, I was trained as an accountant. And I came out of school and went to work for Arthur Andersen as an auditor, where they train you to never trust anything anybody says, examine the evidence for yourself. And I think that training was really fundamental for me. But years later, in 2002, my 44-year-old marathon running, quote, healthy husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And, I'm like, how can somebody who has led this very clean, healthy life be diagnosed with the old person's disease? And, you go into the doctor and they just say, here's kind of the trajectory. There's not a lot we can do. Here's a pill. And it's kind of a slow slide down. And I was like, that's not, this is a systems problem and we're going to figure this out. So I started to study the science, and I started first with food because from my background, I was trained in something called transaction flow review, which is how you look for risk in a business by mapping out what's flowing through the business and where the breakpoints might be. And so I was like, well, what's the main thing flowing through the system? It's food. And so I started to read about and understand our food supply, which I hadn't really thought much about. And most people don't think a lot about it until recently. And I started to see how many chemicals and things were used in the food and made some significant changes to our diet. And just through those changes, he he was diagnosed because he had a tremor. They could see the tremor, and the tremor went away. And pretty remarkably, in a short order of time, we saw changes by making dietary changes. And so I just continued to look deeper and deeper into what was going on with our food, and then starting to connect that to the underlying science behind what they thought was causing Parkinson, or not causing dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, and really looking at that. And then in 2014, I read a book called Missing Microbes by Dr. Martin Blazer. And it was about the rise of chronic diseases in our generation that grew up in the age of antibiotics, and how antibiotics were changing this thing called the microbiome, which I had never heard of. And I'm like, what's that? And, it's the trillions of fungi, bacteria, microbes that live in and on our body, and they function as our internal pharmacy. They're making vitamins, hormones, minerals, transmitters, and we have spent a good section of our life attacking them with antibiotics. And a few months later, the first paper came out where they showed they could divide the two types of Parkinson's by the bacteria in the gut. And I was like, that's it. I quit my job that in commercial real estate, apartment business, and founded a microbiome company to start collecting people's poop and sequencing it, and starting to build computational models and understand not just Parkinson's, but across the population, what's going on with this internal ecosystem that's so important to us, and how can we save it and save ourselves in the process?
So what is going on with it?
Well, we used to live very close to the land. 100 years ago, we were still a very rural people in large part. And many of the microbes that do detoxification and production of a lot of these critical um, molecules in our body are actually soil-based organisms. So we're losing the interaction with the soil-based organisms. We also have sterilized our food the milk is now pasteurized. There were lots of very important microbes in the raw milk that we used to drink and get. And in the soil itself, with the chemicals that we're using to grow the plants and the herbicides and pesticides, we're also killing microbes in the soil that are important for the delivery of micronutrients into the plants themselves. So our plants are less nutritious because of the chemicals we're using, because they don't have the microbes to deliver the nutrients. And so the soil microbiome is depleted and our human microbiome is depleted. So it's antibiotics on the human side and a lot of preservatives in the food supply that also damage those microbes. And then over in the soil, it's all the chemicals that we're using instead of focusing on the soil microbiome and a vital living culture in the soil.
Have you looked at the difference between conventionally grown food agriculture and organic agricultural systems? Does that fix this problem, or is organic simply still growing food, but not not optimal for our microbiome?
Well, I will say organic in large part is better, and there is research showing the difference in nutrient content of organic versus conventional. But what has happened in the last, since 2008, I think, there was a change in the approval for what could be used for organic fertilizer, and they now allow the use of conventional manure. So cow manure and poultry manure from these big poultry and cattle operations, which are heavily fed the GMO chemical laden, uh, glyphosate laden grains. And what happens is that manure still has the glyphosate residues in it. So it does impact the organ. I actually have a paper with Dr. Don Huber about soggy sauerkraut. People can look up and see how it affects the structure of the plant. And the same thing happens with collagen in the human body or collagen in a chicken. So organic is definitely better, but it still has some issues that really need to be addressed from a regulatory perspective.
So going back a few years, there is this research that you're doing on the microbiome, and you're taking samples. You get approval, I believe, right, from the FDA and NIH grant to get fecal samples. Is that the work that you were doing with the
So we
NIH?
did, we went, yeah, so we had two different projects. So one, we set up a biobank, and that's not an NIH process. That's going through a IRB process to collect the sample and
Yeah. To
use
get
it in
institutional
research.
approval to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we went through that process and we developed a kit where we took the whole thing. So in a lot of the research that is out there, they're just taking a little swab. And we actually wanted to take the whole sample. And once we received it, we divided it up into little aliquot tubes so that we could use it, but we could also make it available to other researchers around the globe. And through that process, we actually learned something really valuable about Parkinson's that had never been published, because we were collecting samples from across the population, but in our laboratory, we could actually identify a person with Parkinson's just by looking at their stool sample. So it had a very dense concrete-like colloidal consistency, and at least parts of the stool had this. And we were unable to process it the same way we processed our other samples. And then the grant we got because microbiome research or the sequencing of microbiome samples doesn't have what's called a reference standard. So, if you go to get a blood test, they have a sample that they know exactly what's in it. So when they run your sample, they get the result from the control and they get your result. And if the control is off, they know that maybe something's off with the machine or something. And in microbiome research, there hasn't been a standard reference material. And
Is
so
there
that's what
is
our
there now?
NIH. So we made a reference material. It is available through a company called Zymo Research. And it's kind of slowly making its way into use, but
Yeah,
you know,
I've been to medical talks and on microbiome and different diseases, and they'll give test results or they'll share test results from patients about how their microbiome looks, the types of bacteria and organisms that are in there. And I've never really felt confident enough that first of all I knew enough to be looking at this to really understand the implications. I also wondered what how strong the associations are to these diseases, and also what does healthy really look like. If we're all living, if they're getting these reference ranges and they're getting all these samples now, and we're all essentially being impacted by conventional agriculture, ultra processed foods that change the microbiome, chronic stress that changes the microbiome, the number of people with chronic diseases is high and increasing. How do you define even what is a healthy microbiome?
I think that's actually a great question, and I think the jury is still out. There are papers out there where they say, these are the healthy phenotypes or whatever, but what I would say in looking at the samples over the years is I didn't feel like I saw a lot of healthy microbiome samples. And, to give you an example, there's a company called Open Biome that does fecal transplants, and they screen people for health because they're going to take their stool sample and transplant it in somebody else. And only about 3% of people actually pass their screening, from screening their microbiome to all the other health indicators in the body. So, when I was looking at people's microbiomes, to me, I was like, okay, well, they may not be presenting with any symptoms today, but they don't have a healthy ecosystem. And part of that, I think, of course, there hasn't been any medical training on the microbiome, or very limited training on the microbiome. And it's a complex ecosystem with a lot of different microbes. But, when it comes down to it, you're wanting it to have the functions that you need to operate. It needs to do the detoxification. It needs to make those vitamins that you need. It needs to make neurotransmitters and hormones. And it's that loss of functional capability that's a bigger issue, I think, sometimes
Yeah.
than, who's there, who's not there. But, I will say, we do have some indicators in our Parkinson's research of, some of the gram-negative bacteria that are, potentially key drivers in the physiology of what's happening in Parkinson's over time.
So with Parkinson's and the microbiome, what are some of the losses of function, some of the activities, irrespective of exactly, which genera, which the names of the microorganisms are there? What are some of the activities that are missing in the microbiome that are connected with the development and progression of Parkinson's disease?
Well, interestingly, H. pylori, which is associated with ulcers, H. pylori actually eats dopamine. And dopamine is that neurotransmitter that is most closely associated with Parkinson's, a decline in dopamine and the dopaminergic neurons in the brain. And one thing that has been discovered is that if you have H. pylori and your medicine isn't working or you have more off times, that that H. pylori is actually eating the dopamine. It can eat the dopamine, which makes you have more of an off time. But what we've been working on in a publication we'll have coming out shortly is that H. pylori and a couple of other gram-negative bacteria that have been identified in Parkinson's can produce an enzyme called urease, and that enzyme kills the good bacteria to acquire their calcium and potassium, and then that ultimately causes an electrolyte balance that collapses something called the glycocalyx, and that propagates through the system and disrupts the transmission in the synapses in the brain as well. And so things going on down here are actually very connected to what's going on in the brain. There's also research from Johns Hopkins that has shown that the alpha-synuclein that's aggregating can start in the gut, and it moves up the vagus nerve and into the brain through the vagus nerve.
Well, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. My brain is going crazy right now. I mean, first of all, quick question with the glycocalyx, because that's part of the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels. With that problem being created with the glycocalyx, does that then create a leaky blood-brain barrier? Does it create problems then with more toxins, or molecules that shouldn't be getting into the brain leaking out of the blood vessels actually getting into the brain and creating some problems?
Yes, that's one of the foundational bases of our paper that we're coming out is you have a leaky gut barrier, you have a leaky brain barrier, and you get, so also from the gram-negative bacteria, you have something called lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin, and that's crossing over, and that's highly inflammatory. And actually, there's a Parkinson's model. There's over 500 papers published using the endotoxin model to induce Parkinson's.
Well, in fact, LPS is so well known and so toxic. It's used experimentally to induce inflammation and toxicity into animal experiments. So that's interesting. That's interesting to me as well. I was surprised to hear that they actually decrease the eat glutathione or eat dopamine. I'm sorry. It's typically thought of as the disease Parkinson's as decreased dopamine production in the brain. Is the dopamine, serotonin, for example, is produced primarily in the gut? Is dopamine, melatonin as well? Is there dopamine produced in the gut also, and not just the brain?
Yes. So back to what one thing that people may not realize is bacteria are really, and fungi, but bacteria are kind of the workhorses through fermentation of making just about any molecule you can think of. They can make it, and they make a lot of these neurotransmitters in our gut. And so if we don't have the microbes to make the neurotransmitters, or if we have too many microbes that are eating the neurotransmitters, there's also really there's a book called Psychobiotic Revolution by John Cryan and Ted Dinan, and they were early pioneers, as well as a researcher here in the States by the name of Mark Lyte, Lyte, in the field of microbial endocrinology, which was this understanding that the microbes are making these endocrine hormones and eating them, and this loop that between the brain and the gut, and what a powerful connection that is, because even just stress, you get under stress, you produce stress hormones, and that feeds a certain microbiome that then causes you to be more stressed so that you will produce more food for them. So
And so the interaction then with the gut and the brain and Parkinson's disease, are you is it changing not only the production of dopamine in, or trying to improve that in the to heal the gut and then affect the brain, or is it also affecting the dopamine production in the brain? Do you even, I mean, is that even known?
I I'm not a neuron specialist.
Yeah.
What I will say is we're planning a meeting in May of this year, and we're bringing a lot of the microbiome people together, but also a physical chemist that I've been working on this paper with, Dr. Barry Ninham, who's an expert on the endothelial surface layer glycocalyx, and some neurologists to really look deeper at these connections and try to put together a new paradigm for research, because we've been down this path for decades, just looking at dopamine neurons and alpha-synuclein aggregation. And alpha-synuclein is actually what's called an antimicrobial peptide. And this, similarly with Alzheimer's, beta amyloid is an antimicrobial peptide. So you have something in the body that is capturing microbes to dispose of them, but you're unable to clear the waste properly. So, that's another interesting area of exploration.
So, I mean, we define the problem to a certain extent. I'm sure it's a lot
Yeah.
more, intricate and in depth than this. But given just the short amount of time we have here, what then do people do about it? So, okay, you've identified this issue with the microbiome disruption. Should they just all go off the grid and start growing their own food? Does it have to be that? Should they just go and buy a probiotic and start popping pills? I mean, what are I love when people identify the problem, but then the next, of course, logical question is, what's the solution?
Well, I wish I had a really easy, simple answer for you. What I can tell you is diet and lifestyle. And, I made a probiotic for my husband that had a significant impact on endotoxin, so lowered endotoxin. We did a clinical trial on people with diabetes and showed a reduction in 100% of the people who took it in endotoxin. So, focusing on gut health and restoring your gut health. I do know also a gentleman in the United Kingdom with Parkinson's, through focusing on his gut health and stress management, has reversed what they called stage 5 Parkinson's back to stage 2.
Wow.
So, but that was a 2-year process of very focused attention on healing his gut, and cutting back his actual medication profile. And his doctor in the UK worked with him to do that. And that's not always an easy thing to get buy-in here,
Right.
to look at that. But the medications also have a pretty significant impact on the glycocalyx and on our gut lining. And typically in the course of Parkinson's, you start out, maybe you're on one medication and they're adding over time because you're getting side effects from the medication.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like all chronic diseases, this makes me think of them, that they didn't start overnight. And it took decades really to develop some of these challenges that people are experiencing. And your story of this gentleman in the UK reminds me of that there is not a magic bullet. There is not one simple thing, and it does take time and consistent effort. But what you're saying is what the research has shown for, other conditions as well, like cardiovascular disease, diabetes. People can provide the right environment for the body to heal and optimize its function, and people to feel better. And it sounds like with Parkinson's disease, that's what you're seeing as well, not only in out in the real world, but also in clinical practice. Or in research, the data
Mm-hmm.
more and more is there showing the ability to decrease endotoxins, the ability to create a microenvironment that is more hospitable to people healing and feeling better. And you saw that with your husband.
I did, until he had he had a very severe case of COVID at the end of 2021, and had long COVID, and he had a pulmonary embolism in September and passed away. And there is definitely a connection even to that and the long COVID back to the microbiome. So there is research showing that people with Parkinson's have very low bifidobacteria,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very important uh, species that we typically get colonized with as babies, as if we're breastfed. Of course, we're a generation of people who weren't necessarily breastfed, but in Parkinson's, there's lower bifidobacteria. There's also in the people who had the most severe cases of COVID, there is lower bifidobacteria, and there is one trial from a Dr. Sabine Hazan showing that the vaccine for COVID actually killed the bifidobacteria. So, and that's a very protective organism that produces something called plasmalogens for the brain, which are Dan Goodnow actually is probably one of the world's experts on that. And but when we lose that bifidobacteria, it also keeps a number of the pathogens in check. And so there's that connection back to if that's been lowered, from birth, really. And my husband had a long history of taking antibiotics as a child for strep infections. He worked on a golf course in high school where he was exposed to a lot of chemicals that are used as herbicides on the golf course. And then he worked in the oil and gas industry where he was exposed to hydrocarbons. So if
Mm-hmm.
you think about, that long-term building of the ecosystem, and then starting in the 1990s, when genetically engineered corn and soy really came widespread into the market, then the food contamination with glyphosate, which has only increased over time, started to be more and more of an issue. And because he was a runner, and he did a lot of carb loading, so he ate a very high carb diet. He was, I think, exposed to more of those chemicals from the grains, and he also drank a soy protein shake every day for 2 years before he was diagnosed. And looking back now, the pretty much all of the soybeans are contaminated with glyphosate, and that destroys the gut microbiome, destroys the soil microbiome. So there are 3 amino acids called the aromatic amino acids: tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine, that we don't make. We have to get from our food or from the bacteria in our gut that make it. And the pathway for making those amino acids is actually the target of glyphosate.
That's fascinating. And you write about some of these things in the microbiome and what people can do. You have a blog, you have some websites. Tell people how they can learn more, because you've got not just information on there, but actions that people can take to improve their health and protect their health. So tell people where they can find out more of that information.
Sure. For anyone who has Parkinson's or has a loved one with Parkinson's, I write about alternative health and the microbiome research at my blog Martha's Quest. And actually that can be helpful for people who don't have Parkinson's, a lot of the things that I write there, but it is targeted toward the Parkinson's audience. And then our bio collective tells more of the history of the sample bank collection and all of the work that we've done there. And then we developed a line of probiotics that started with the first one I made for my husband, and that's called BiotiQuest. That's BiotiQuest. And the product I originally made for my husband is called Sugar Shift, and that changes sugar metabolism in the body and improves energy metabolism, basically by restoring the Krebs cycle.
I love it, and we'll link to all of those in the show notes before. And just the last minute or two that we have, is there anything that we didn't touch on, or any last words you just want to leave people with?
Well, I mean, we talked about the connection to the soil, but one of the things I said before we got on here is, we can't, when I started to see these problems, it's like you can't sit by and wait for somebody else to solve the problem. And I was talking to my chief scientific officer, Dr. Raul Cano, and I said, we're helping people with their gut, but they're constantly being assaulted over here on the food supply. We've got to come up with something for the soil. And so Raul and I sat down and came up with a soil probiotic that actually breaks down glyphosate and makes nutrients more accessible for the plant and restores the respiration of the soil and soil quality. And we've done studies in about 10 different crops now, with great results on improving yield. And we did one study in grapes where we showed that we could actually lower the amount of glyphosate residues that were in the grapes for a vintner in California. And so I'm optimistic as we go into this year, because we have a big farming group in Pennsylvania and up and down the East Coast that's starting to use our products. And
Amazing.
um,
Amazing.
I think that, together we can fix the problem if we don't just sit around and wait for somebody else to fix it.
Well, and we need brilliant innovators that are highly motivated, just like you, who are looking at this meticulously and methodically and assembling teams to solve some of the biggest problems that we have. And unfortunately, some of those biggest problems when it comes to healthcare are self-induced by our modern society, in which has given us so many comforts. But a lot of that is coming with a cost, we've found out. So thank you for the work that you've done. And I know it came out of your own family challenges and struggles, and that's often what motivates a lot of us to do what we do. But you're creating solutions that are going to pay that forward and help countless millions and millions of other people. So thank you, everybody. Definitely check out Martha's websites, information, blogs, products, because she is one of a kind, and I think she's created something very special here. Thank you for being on my podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, John.